on with it.
What was Mr. Houghton's role in preparing the report?
In the early stages of preparing the report, probably not much until it got to be towards final.
And how did his involvement change as it got towards final?
Well, at the end of the process, he kind of made the final edits to the report based on the information that had been gathered in the report thus far.
Was there anyone in your mind who had final sign-off on the contents of the report?
The CAO.
So after the July 16th, 2012 meeting, we see that WGD is brought in to assist with the research and investigation that's going on with respect to the arena. Can you just explain what WGD was retained to do?
They were asked to provide a cost estimate on a traditional bricks and mortar pre-hinge steel arena.
When you say a traditional bricks and mortar pre-hinge steel arena, are you talking about two different types of buildings, or is that?
No, that would be one. The main structure would be pre-hinge steel, but the lobby areas would typically be upgraded with architectural block or something like that.
And how was it decided that WGD would provide that information?
Because they were already involved in the project at Central Park. They were aware of the parameters that would affect an arena in Central Park. And they were already engaged.
Do you know who decided to engage WGD for this part of the project?
I think Ms. Proctor and myself had a discussion about whether it would be logical to assign them that additional task in the context of what they were already engaged to do.
And was it your view that that would be something that was logical?
Yes.
And why is that?
As I said, primarily because they already had the groundwork done. They knew the park. They knew the requirements of an arena for Collingwood. So it was logical, and the additional cost would not have been significant relative to the work that they've already done.
Did WGD have expertise that the town didn't have available to it in-house?
Yes.
What sorts of expertise?
Architects and engineers and designers.
We could pull up paragraph 261 of the foundation document. So this paragraph reflects that on July 19th, 2012, you emailed Marta Proctor with a memorandum titled ICE Arena Feasibility Study, and in the body of your email you said draft terms of reference attached. And if we could open up the attachment, TOC 0187442. So this was the attachment to the email that was described. What was the purpose of this document?
Can you scroll down a little?
Feel free to direct the court operator to scroll at whatever pace works for you.
Yeah, I just want to see what's down on, it looks like there's 3 pages. Keep going. Okay. So the purpose of this document was to give WGD the scope of what we were wanting them to look at, what the features of the arena would be, so that they could take that and turn that into a conceptual design and provide cost estimates for that.
Was this a document that someone directed you to prepare for WGD?
I think it was further to the discussions that I'd had with Ms. Proctor, that we needed to have some terms of reference to give them, and so that was the basis for developing it.
Can you tell me more about the discussions you had with Ms. Proctor after the July 16th meeting, and as you're turning your minds to how to deliver what council's asked for?
I think they were technical in nature. How are we going to do the comparison between different types of arenas, and what would we get WGD to do? What other means would we have available to get estimates and so forth?
Were there any other means that were identified that could assist?
I don't recall any meetings.
In your conversations with Ms. Proctor, do you recall her at any point expressing any frustration in the point in the process?
I think at a global level, there was frustration there in the work that the steering committee had done, and where it was at that point. Was it going to continue? Was this a new direction? And so there was some frustration at that level, but I don't remember any specific points.
Did you feel any frustration at this point?
Not that I recall.
In your mind, was it still an open question about whether or not council would proceed with the Central Park Steering Committee recommendation or take a new direction?
I think at this point in time it was still an open question.
When for you was it no longer an open question?
At some point, I believe that council rescinded their support for the work that the steering committee had done. Was that? I'm not sure. But somewhere between that July 16th meeting and the August 27th deadline for the report, my sense would be that that's when the the tides kind of turned.
And did you have a sense of what precipitated the tides turning in between that July 16th and August 27th period?
I guess my sense would be that the discussion around the council table, maybe not around the council table, the discussion in the community and amongst councillors and senior staff that that the cost of the steering committee work seemed to be too big for the community to take on at that point in time, and they were looking for alternatives.
So if we could pull TOC 0187442 back up on the screen. So this was the document we were just looking at. We see in the emails that you consulted with Marta Proctor on the content of this document. Did you consult with anyone else on staff?
Not that I can remember, no.
So we see that a version is sent to WGD on July 20th, 2012, and I'll ask that that version gets pulled up. It's TOC 0188041.1.1.1. This is the version that's sent to WGD on July 20th, and if we can go down to page 2. And scroll down a little bit. So this is a section titled Terms of Reference, and in the second paragraph, a second or third paragraph on the screen, it begins with the feasibility of several options should be examined in terms of a comparison to the overall Central Park redevelopment scope. This will allow the costs and benefits of various opportunities to be compared directly, while also enabling the preparation of operating estimates and the exploration of anticipated social improvements. And if we can scroll down, the last sentence on this page says the following scenarios are to be considered as a minimum. Alternatives may be provided should they enhance the opportunity for the park for part of the project to forward. And if we scroll down, there are then a table setting out 4 scenarios. How are these 4 scenarios identified for WGD?
I'm sorry, I don't understand that question. How were they identified for WGD?
How was it decided that these would be the 4 scenarios that would be presented to WGD as a minimum for consideration?
I think this was developed through discussion with Ms. Proctor. And trying to keep all the options on the table so that we could have the basis to make selection or recommendation on the best path forward.
And before we got to this table, we saw language in the document about the feasibility of several options should be examined, and that these 4 options were scenarios that should be considered at a minimum. Was it your expectation that WGD would look into or consider options beyond these 4?
I don't think I had any thought that they would come up with other options other than this. Because I believe, if I'm reading the titles correctly here, I believe that this looks at a different types of building construction. It looks at a pre-hinge style building versus a fabric membrane. It addresses the upgrade of the Eddie Bush Arena. I don't think that we would have expected them to go outside of that.
So if we could scroll up to page 2 again. And again, looking at that language about the following scenarios are to be considered as a minimum, and alternatives may be provided. Do you know what the purpose of those words were?
I guess only that we weren't closing the door for them to come with other alternatives, and part of this process was to determine how the project could be logically phased into a bigger project in the future. That may have been part of what was being referenced by alternatives, was the phasing approach.
What in your mind was going to be potentially phased about the project?
A single pad arena versus a single pad arena that could be twinned in the future, and could have other future additions that would move closer, I guess, to what the steering committee had recommended in the overall grand plan for Central Park.
We could scroll down back to page 3. The first column here talks about the proposed Central Park redevelopment project components, and these would be the components that were in the steering committee's final report. Is that accurate?
That's what I would understand, yes.
Was there any additional work that you were expecting WGD to do with respect to the Central Park Steering Committee's report?
No, this was, I think that was put into this for context.
Then we see the next 2 columns deal with the construction or the feasibility of a single pad arena. One is an initial phase of a single pad arena, necessary park improvements with future option to combine into an overall redevelopment concept. And the second is a standalone single pad arena with potential to twin in the future, minimal park improvements, no automatic path to proposed concept. Can you explain what the difference is between these 2 single pad scenarios?
I think the first one would take the overall design that came out of the steering committee work and try to snip an arena out of it, build that arena that could be added to get to the final design that the steering committee had come up with. Or the second one just contemplates an arena that could be twinned in the future without necessarily going all the way to the recommendations of the steering committee.
And is that what is meant by no automatic path to proposed concept?
That's what I read.
we see ultimately that a single pad arena approach is selected or recommended by staff. Which one of the two was recommended?
The second.
And do you recall what led to the second scenario contemplated here for the arena being the one that was recommended?
I think because that aligned more closely with the information that we were comparing to from Sprung.
Can you just explain what you mean by that?
Over the course of that month or whatever, I think the idea of developing it into what would essentially be a multi-use recreation facility became less important as opposed to getting an arena built.
And how did you see that develop from your perspective?
I guess one of the aspects is that the multi-use concept incorporated a pool. And the other side of the discussion was covering the pool. And if you were going to make that investment in covering the existing pool, then it took that piece out of the equation for Central Park.
Wasn't that the case then that when council directed staff to develop a timeline and estimates for covering the pool and made that selection, the second column here was essentially rendered, ineffective or not something that would be pursued?
It became less important.
We see when it came to the two.
Sorry, Your Honor, I missed that. What became less important? Column 2 or column 3? I wasn't clear.
Column 2.
Thank you.
In both scenarios with the arena, it identifies a fabric membrane as an option that could be included, and then it says sprung or equivalent. Do you know why sprung was specifically identified in this document that was provided at WGD?
I think at this point, we only knew of one supplier for a building or a fabric membrane structure that was like a sprung building. I think we wanted to say that it would be that style of fabric structure as opposed to an agricultural style structure.
So do I take it from your answer, this was the way of drawing that distinction we talked about last day as between agricultural style buildings, which you looked at 2009, 2010, and what Sprung offered with the membrane and the extruded steel?
Yes.
Do you ever have any discussions with WGD about whether or not they were aware of any companies that provided a product similar to Sprung?
I had discussions with them about how the Sprung how the sprung building was put together and how it varied from the agricultural style fabric building. And at least in the beginning of those discussions, they weren't aware of a sprung type structure. And so they wouldn't have known whether there was similar ones to a sprung type structure because they didn't understand the parameters in the first place.
Did they come to understand the parameters?
As we were able to provide them direction to the sales information of a sprung structure, I believe that they came to understand what the differences were.
And after that, did you have, or to your knowledge, anyone on staff have further discussions with them about whether or not they knew of any other competing manufacturers?
Not that I recall, but we would have welcomed that if they had suggested it.
In the next bullet point, it talks about other affordable structure over a Nicholas Arena in both columns 2 and 3. We see that WGD provides estimates with respect to pre-engineered steel construction. Were there any other forms of structure that you were aware of at this point in time that could be a possibility for a new arena?
Not that I was aware of.
If we could scroll down, keep going to page 4. So these identify potential implications and benefits. One of which, if you look in the second column and the second last bullet point, is fabric membrane structure may be repurposed in the future. Where did that information come from?
I think it was through discussions in some of the early meetings with Sprung that they were suggesting that one of the merits of their building is that it could be taken down and moved to a new location or a new purpose. If that was desired, it was possible to do that.
As part of those discussions, did Sprung indicate that that is something that had happened with their structures in the past?
I can't recall specifically.
Are you aware of any Sprung structures that have been repurposed or relocated?
I'm not aware.
You know if anyone on staff or if Sprung ever provided information on the costs associated with dismantling and repurposing a Sprung structure?
Not that I'm aware of.
If we could go now to paragraph 270 of the foundation document. So just to assist you in time, Mr. McNulty, WGD has sent that terms of reference feasibility study on July 20th. There was some further discussions with WGD we see in the documents, and then this is describing an email chain involving the EMC and yourself from July 24th, 2012. In the email that's being described, the treasurer, Ms. Leonard, stated that she had asked you to continue to work with WGD on a list of items, including redrawing certain parts of the schematics and providing pricing for both a prefabricated steel structure and a bricks and mortar building. With respect to Sprung, then Ms. Leonard's stated, and it says, leave the Sprung building pricing for now until management team and Dave McNulty can meet with Sprung people. Once we have the pricing and operating costs for the buildings from WGD, somebody, Ed, Dave, and the management team will contact Sprung to get pricing to ensure that we are comparing apples to apples. What Ms. Leonard describes in the quoted section of her email, was that your understanding of the plan going forward at this point in time on July 24th, 2012?
That's what I read in the email or the section. And it was to me it was a means of moving forward to make sure that we had a direct comparison between the two.
Do you recall if at this point in time it was your anticipation that after pricing information was obtained by WGD, that someone from staff would then go to Sprung and get pricing information from them?
That's what I understand.
So if we scroll down, I'm going to walk you through a sequence of events that happens in the next few paragraphs, and then we'll have some questions. So Ms. Leonard sends the email that was described above, and then acting CAO Ed Houghton responds on the same day, writing that the town needed to have operational information for the bricks and mortar buildings and the structural steel building, and he adds, actually, I'm not sure where this building fits into the equation, but I may have missed it. You then respond to Mr. Houghton that the prefab steel type arena is in response to the request in our terms of reference for other affordable structures as more or less direct comparison to a Sprung arena. This is in contrast to the, quote, bricks and mortar approach, which I would essentially call phase one of the Central Park plan as presented by the steering committee. Pausing here for a second, when you're describing the terms of reference in this email, is that the document we were just looking at that set out the 4 columns of scenarios?
I would believe so.
Then you go on to say, Mr. McNulty then wrote that there was 2 components of the operation cost to consider. If you scroll down, you continue, presumably I'm still okay to carry on the discussion with Sprung on covering the Centennial Pool, and I will discuss the rest of the heritage part things to identify any concerns with Brian JP. Then we scroll down. Mr. Houghton then responds and says, responds to an issue dealing with the staffing costs and operational costs. And then he goes on to say, the second thing is regarding the structural steel building, you mention it is in response to the request in our terms of reference for, quote, other affordable structures. And then he asks, what do you mean by our terms of reference? Go down to paragraph 273. You then reply and provide Mr. Houghton with an explanation about what the terms of reference are and what you're referring to. Pausing at this point, do you recall if prior to this email chain you had discussed the terms of reference with Mr. Houghton?
Prior to when it was forwarded to him, I may not have. Because it was being developed along with the department head.
Did Mr. Houghton have any involvement in developing the terms of reference?
Not that I recall.
after this email chain, do you recall if you had any subsequent conversations with Mr. Houghton about the terms of reference and what its purpose was?
Not that I recall.
Scrolling down at paragraph 274, Mr. Houghton then responds to you, and as opposed to the other emails in this chain, the rest of the EMC is not included, so this email is only to you. And he says, the last point I should make is that I will be the contact person with Sprung. The deputy mayor made that perfectly clear with me on the weekend. Do you recall getting this direction from Mr. Houghton?
Yes.
What was your understanding of the purpose of this direction?
I didn't have an in-depth understanding other than there should be one point of contact, and it was going to be Mr. Houghton.
The notion that there should be one point of contact, is that something Mr. Houghton explained to you or you discussed with him?
No.
Do you have any discussions after receiving this email with Mr. Houghton about the reasoning for him being the contact person with Sprung?
No.
In the situation of a potential procurement or purchase, was it common, in your experience, for the CAO to be designated as the contact person with a potential supplier?
That would not be common.
What would typically happen?
Staff at a lower level would typically take on that work with a supplier to work out the details and then bring it forward.
And why would that usually be for staff at a lower level?
Just for the efficiency of everybody's time.
Can you explain more what you mean by that?
It wouldn't require the CAO's time or energy to go through that back and forth with the supplier.
Do you have any sense why in this instance that normal course approach was not followed?
I don't know.
Do you ever have any discussions with Mr. Houghton about why that approach wasn't followed?
No, the direction was quite clear.
Do you ever have any discussions with the deputy mayor about this direction?
No.
Throughout the time period between July 16th, 2012 to August 27th, 2012, did you have any direct conversations with the deputy mayor about the recreation facilities?
No.
We could pull up paragraph 24 of summary document 2-4. So we had been looking at an email chain amongst yourself and the members of the EMC, and then an email from Ed Houghton to you about him being the contact person with Sprung on July 24th, 2012. This paragraph describes an email chain between yourself and Brian Gregerson at WGD. Mr. Gregerson begins his email thanking you for the call, for the phone call in direction, and provides a summary list of what had been discussed on that call. As a starting point, do you recall having a conversation with WGD on July 25th, 2012?
I'm not specific on the date, but I had conversations with them.
So I will ask that we open up the email itself. It's CJI 0006682.0016. And if we go to the bottom of the email chain. So I'm just going to orient you for a moment, Mr. McNulty. This email at the bottom here is from Mr. Gregerson to you, copying Richard Dabris. It's setting thank you for the call and setting out a summary of the call. And then if you scroll up, see that you reply to Mr. Gregerson's email saying see comments below in red. So if you scroll back down, it appears that you have gone into the text of Mr. Gregerson's email and provided some comments, and the way it's reproduced, it looks like it's in a slightly lighter font. Does that sound accurate to you?
Yes.
So looking at item number 3, Mr. Gregerson wrote, the arena design concept will focus on the pre-eng structure and a generic roof membrane system. Pausing there, we see that as ultimately the comparison that WGD provides. Prior to this email, were you aware of any other options that were being considered?
No.
Prior to this, do you recall if WGD ever presented any potential options to the town beyond a fabric building or a pre-eng building?
No.
In that same bullet point, Mr. Gregerson wrote, Sprung is not to be contacted at this time, to which you respond correct. What was the origin of the direction to WGD not to contact Sprung?
It followed from the direction that the CAO was to be the contact with Sprung. And that led to the understanding that it wasn't that WGD wasn't to contact Sprung either.
How did you come to understand that Mr. Houghton's direction also applied to WGD?
I don't specifically recall. I expect that there were ongoing discussions with the department head at that time as well. And I recall perhaps from some of these documents that her understanding as well was that WGD shouldn't contact Sprung directly.
Is that a conversation you had with Ms. Proctor?
I can't recall a specific conversation, but that's the sense that I have.
Did you have a view whether it made sense to direct WGD not to contact Sprung?
That would make their work more difficult. But that was the direction that we had.
And in your view, why would that make their work more difficult?
Because they could have reached out to Sprung and got specific information on the Sprung structure directly, as opposed to relying on sales type information and anything that we could provide.
And when you say sales type information, what do you mean? Just
Their website, essentially, and any sales information that would have been posted on their website.
Other than what you've already described about having a single point of contact with Sprung, did you have an understanding of any other reason why WGD should not be in contact with Sprung?
No.
Looking down to the sixth bullet point, it says the pool is not to be included, to which you respond correct. Do you recall the nature of the conversation on the phone call with WGD with respect to whether or not they should be looking at the pool?
I don't remember the specifics of the phone call.
Prior to this email and the phone conversation that it contemplates, was it being considered that, was it under consideration that WGD might also look into the pool?
Not that I recall.
Do you have any sense of why this was a point that WGD was seeking confirmation on at this point in time?
The WGD work was focused on Central Park, and they had no awareness of the pool or the Heritage Park potential development, and so that was not in their scope of work.
On Tuesday, you agreed that before council proceeded with a fabric structure over the pool, that it would be a good idea for serious consideration to be given to other types of structures that could be used to cover the pool. In your view, was there an opportunity available to the town to have WGD look into other types of structures that could cover the pool?
The opportunity was there if we had have broadened their scope to look at that. I think the selected recommendation to cover the pool with a fabric building didn't lead us in that direction.
Do you recall any discussions about whether or not even though that direction from council was a fabric building for the pool, that this work should be undertaken in any event?
I don't recall that conversation, no.
We could go to paragraph 275 of the foundation document. So this paragraph contemplates a meeting being set up as between certain staff and Tom Lloyd of Sprung, and this proposed date is July 27th, 2012. Do you recall if you attended the meeting that's contemplated here?
If I was invited to this meeting, I would have attended.
Did you attend meetings with Sprung or BLT between July 16th and August 27th, 2012?
Between July 16th and August 27th?
Yes, between the two council meetings.
Not that I recall in that time period. Because, I mean, I'm not sure of the exact timing, but I think in that time period, the contact with Sprung was designated to be the CAO.
Stepping back for a second, do you recall when you first were introduced to who BLT was?
Yes.
What do you recall about that?
It was in one of the early meetings with Sprung representatives, and BLT was present, and BLT was presented as Sprung's preferred erector, preferred contractor for Ontario for their buildings.
And what did that mean, or how was it explained what a preferred erector was?
It was along the lines of that BLT was an authorized dealer for Sprung, but didn't quite go that far. It was more, if we're going to sell a Sprung building in Ontario, then BLT would be their preferred contractor to build that building.
Was it your understanding that the town would have to use BLT if they decided to proceed with Sprung?
That was the understanding that was presented. If you pushed back on that, would they have would they have accepted another contractor? Maybe, but it was presented as this is our preferred contractor for Ontario that knows our buildings, knows how to build them, and so that they would be the ones building it.
Did anyone at the meeting you were at push back on the notion that BLT would come along with Sprung?
No.
At any other time, do you know if anyone approached Sprung or discussed further with Sprung whether another contractor could be used?
Not that I'm aware of.
Do you recall being present for any discussions amongst staff about whether or not the town should consider, if it's going to proceed with Sprung, looking at other potential contractors?
No, I don't recall any other conversation.
Was it something that had crossed your mind at that point in time?
At that point in time, I don't believe it crossed my mind because this was being presented as a design-build contract. And in my experience with a design-build contract, the contracting group, the supplying group, have relationships with each other and have established relationships with each other, and that's the basis for how they put their projects together. If it were not going to be a design-build project, then there would be opportunity to entertain other contractors or the thought of other contractors, but it wasn't abnormal to me in a design-build contract for the vendor to bring their team.
In your view, was it possible to proceed with a sprung structure and not proceed with a design-build contract?
It would have been possible. It wasn't considered at the time that I recall.
Do you know how it came to be that the consideration when it came to sprung and the sprung structure was we're looking at a design-build option?
I think that that's the way that it was presented from the beginning
Presented by who?
by Sprung.
Was it the case then that your understanding was that Sprung and BLT were making a joint proposal to the town of Collingwood?
Yes. Yes, a joint proposal. At the end of the day, one of them had to be the lead on that, and that ended up being BLT.
Do you know how that decision was arrived at, where BLT would be the lead at the end of the day?
No, that would, in my mind, that would have been their decision.
So we have looked at the work that WGD was asked to do with respect to comparing the two types of construction. And we see in the documents that throughout July into August, WGD is preparing the work they've been asked to prepare. During that same time period, what was Sprung and BLT doing in terms of preparing to assist the town in making its decision?
If I'm thinking of the time frame right, we had provided them with details of the existing park and amenities, and they would have been developing a conceptual design and putting together cost estimates.
You discussed yesterday that the early meetings with Sprung we saw in July 2012 were part of an investigative process. And so from the standpoint of a procurement, it was okay to be meeting with them at that point in time.
Yes.
The work that Sprung and BLT did for the town in terms of developing design and cost estimates, was that part of the investigative process?
Yes.
At what point then does the investigative process end?
It should have ended by the time that staff was starting to prepare a staff report.
We could open up paragraph 293. So, Mr. McNulty, this paragraph describes two documents that you sent to Dennis Seymour on August 2nd, 2012 at 9:38 a.m. And I'll ask that those documents be opened. The first is TOC 0194603. And if you could just scroll through the documents so Mr. McNulty can get a sense of the whole document, and feel free to direct the court operator. So that's the first of the two attachments, Mr. McNulty, dealing with the pool, and then the second one is TOC 0194604. And if you could just scroll down. This is the second attachment, similar format to the first, but dealing with the arena. Are you familiar with these documents?
Yes.
What was the purpose of these documents?
I think to aid in developing the scope or the design parameters for both the pool and the arena. I think to begin to develop common ground between what Sprung would propose and the information that WGD was developing.
Was the intent then to provide these documents to Sprung or BLT?
I think so.
Do you know if this, well, actually, different question. The design components that are listed in these documents, do you know where they originated from?
I recall a meeting with some town staff and Sprung, where we discussed what the components of the facilities would be. And I think that these lists were sort of documenting what was discussed in terms of what they were developing as a conceptual design.
So if we could go to paragraph 295 of the foundation document.
Just before you do that, I thought the point of contact was supposed to be Mr. Houghton, but you were just saying that there was a meeting between town staff and Sprung. So then why couldn't WGD meet with Sprung?
I think it has to do with time frame, and I noticed that this was August 2nd. I don't recall exactly when the direction from the CAO came that they should be the only, that the CAO should be the only contact with Sprung, but my sense is that that direction came after this point.
I thought it was July 24th.
Perhaps I could be of some assistance in setting out the timeline. Mr. Houghton sent the direction on July 24th. If we go to paragraph 292, this paragraph contemplates a meeting scheduled with Sprung for August 3rd, 2012. And if we scroll down, go to paragraph 295. On August 3rd, Larry Irwin emails Dave McNeil of Sprung notes from today's meeting, and the attachment to that email is the list that we were looking at with some additional items identified in red. So it appears that there was a meeting on August 3rd with representatives of Sprung. Do you recall if you attended that meeting, Mr. McNulty?
I recall being at a meeting where that list was discussed. I would have thought it might have been earlier in the process, but it is what it is.
To his honor's question, do you recall why it was the case that staff members were meeting with Sprung at this point in time after WGD had been told that they shouldn't be in contact with Sprung?
The time frame eludes me as to what steps happened first. My recollection is that we had the direction that the CAO was to be the point of contact. This meeting apparently happened after that. At some point in there, we sent the terms of reference to WGD, which I think were based on these same lists. So that's what I can recall.
But why wouldn't WGD be at the meeting then? I mean, they're being asked to do the pricing, or whatever you call it.
Not on a Sprung building, specifically. On a comparable to Sprung or a pre-eng style building.
They were not asked to estimate the cost of a Sprung building. They were asked to estimate the cost of a similar type of building.
I think the options provided to WGD were a Sprung type building or equivalent, or an alternative economical building type, such as a pre-eng steel building.
Wouldn't a Sprung type building include a Sprung building?
Yes. I didn't organize the meeting.
I didn't, Mr. McNally, I did not mean to imply that you organized the meeting.
Okay.
I certainly did not intend to do that.
If we could go back, if we could open the attachment that's referred to the notes from this meeting on August 3rd, 2012, and TOC 0195146. Scroll down. This is for the arena. We see that it's a similar list to the list that you had sent to Dennis Seymour on August 2nd, although there's some items added in red, some items crossed out. You said you recalled attending a meeting where these design components were discussed. It appears this was a meeting where that happened. Do you know if there was any meetings before this in which Sprung or BLT was present to discuss potential design components?
I believe it was discussed at previous meetings. There were previous meetings with Sprung. I'm questioning myself as to whether this might have been a second iteration of those discussions. I certainly remember being present at a meeting when those items were discussed.
Do you know if this list of design components was provided to WGD?
I don't recall if the list in this form was presented to WGD, but our intention was to have WGD and Sprung looking at the same components.
And what steps were taken to seek to have WGD and Sprung looking at the same components?
I don't recall specifically. And I'm looking at this list now, and I see that it contemplates a second floor mezzanine and an elevator and so forth. So this list, at this point in time, may not have been provided to WGD.
And why do those elements make you believe that's the case?
Because in the information that eventually came back from WGD, there was not a second floor mezzanine included.
Do you have an understanding why WGD was not advised about the interest in including a second floor mezzanine?
I don't recall.
You can pull up CJI 7092.
Are you going on to something else, or are you still?
It's related to this. So. So if we could scroll down. So this is an email that you were not a party to, Mr. McNulty, in which Abby Steck sends certain people at BLT a document that she describes as a scope of work for the arena and the pool. And if we can open up what Ms. Steck has now identified as the attachment, CJI 6583. And if we can scroll down. So this attachment, can just scroll through the whole document, contains the text of what we saw you send Dennis Seymour more or less on the day before, on August 2nd, 2012. Do you have any understanding of how Ms. Steck obtained the information that was in the the documents you had prepared for Mr. Seymour's review?
No.
Were you aware at this point in time that Ms. Steck had this information?
No.
I am about to move away from this document or move on to another topic if you want to take a break or if you have a question.
We'll take a short recess, Mr. McNulty. 10 minutes or so.
All lines.
Before we broke, we were looking at a document that was on Greenleaf letterhead or memo head and had been sent to BLT by Abby Steck. In August 2012, did you have any knowledge of the Greenleaf company?
No.
At any point in time, did you speak with Ms. Steck about Sprung or the recreation facilities before August 27th?
No.
You ever speak to her after August 27th about the
No.
facilities? Sorry. Prior to August 27th, 2012, did you have any conversations with Paul Bonwick about Sprung or the recreation facilities?
No.
Do you have any conversations with him afterwards?
No.
At what point in time did you learn that Greenleaf, Ms. Steck, or Mr. Bonwick had been working with BLT in respect of the recreation facilities?
Years later, after it was in the media.
We could pull up paragraph 27 of summary document 24. So this is this describing an email from Mr. Houghton to yourself while you were on vacation, it appears, about the staff report that was going to be prepared with respect to the two Sprung facilities. And he writes that it must be prepared for the 21st so that it can go to the department's heads. You responded that we have asked WGD to have all information for Central Park back to us by August 15th. We'll have to make sure we have Sprung information by then as well. Mr. Houghton then replies, remind me, what was WGD doing again? It seems we may not need them. You know what Mr. Houghton meant at this point in time when he said we may not need WGD?
No.
Did you ever have a discussion with Mr. Houghton where he explained why WGD might not be necessary at this point?
I don't believe so.
Are you aware of any reason why staff would not need WGD's report at this point in time?
No.
Board. Mr. McNulty, you said in the email there, we will have to make sure we have all the Sprung information by then as well. Were you expecting Mr. Houghton to have the Sprung information?
I believe so.
So then, the WGD information, which wasn't going to include Sprung, I guess, because they'd been precluded from contacting Sprung, was going to go to Mr. Houghton, who had the Sprung information, and then there was going to be a report prepared. Was that how it was supposed to work?
I wouldn't have expected Mr. Houghton to draft the report. I would have expected myself or the department head to disseminate the information, compare it, and perhaps discuss it, and then start to develop a report.
But you were expecting to get, correct me if I'm wrong, you were expecting to get the Sprung information from Mr. Houghton for the report.
Yes.
Thank you.
We go to paragraph 36 of this summary document. So this paragraph explains that On August 16th, 2012, WGD sent Ms. Proctor and yourself a series of documents, including the first version of their report comparing the fabric building to a pre-engineered steel building. If we can scroll down to paragraph 38. So the version of the report that was sent at this point in time discussed the interior and exterior building component specifications, green options, and preliminary outline of specifications for the major building areas components. And then with respect to the heading pre-engineered structure versus membrane envelope energy usage, it stated that the normal insulation values for a pre-engineered sandwich panel structure is R19 for roofs and R12 for walls. Membrane structures by their nature have no inherent thermal resistant R value. And then it goes on to talk about that there's insufficient detail to do accurate modeling in terms of energy usage. Looking at the first paragraph, can you first explain to someone who may not know what R value is when it comes to insulation?
A given insulation has a insulating value per inch of thickness, and so a different thickness of insulation will have a different R value. It represents the its ability to stop heat transfer.
So the higher the R value number, the greater the insulative properties?
Correct.
What WG wrote in the first draft of the report, that the membrane structures by their nature have no inherent thermal resistant R value, was that something you understood to be true at this point in time?
WGD's understanding at this point, for whatever reason, had reverted back to the agricultural style fabric building, which has no insulating value because there's no insulation. And I recall a bit of frustration that that they had not yet come to an understanding that the sprung style of building was constructed differently and did have insulation.
How were they to come to that understanding if they couldn't speak to sprung?
That information would have been available on the sprung website.
When you spoke earlier about how the direction not to speak to sprung would have made WGD's work more difficult, is this an example of a way in which it was made more difficult because it did not have direct access to sprung?
Yes, that would be an example.
So if we can go to paragraph...
Just before you do that, I'm a little confused because I thought in one of your responses to me, WGD were not, you thought they were not looking at a sprung structure, but sprung-like structures, and or membranes other than sprung membranes. Was that right? Did I?
That's right, and I think, again, if I have the time frame correct, the terms of reference document that was created for WGD along this process, it stated sprung or sprung or similar equivalent. And I believe that in conversation, telephone conversations, I think I tried to explain the building system and how it was different than a traditional egg-style membrane building.
So their understanding of what a sprung building or a sprung membrane structure was like would come from you. Is that
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
And if we could scroll down to paragraph 39, we see in this paragraph that you respond or you provide WGD in response to the report a sprung slideshow about performance arenas, and in it you write that it attaches a brochure on insulated fabric membrane arenas in terms of thermal performance. Their claim is R30, and then you talk about the spacing of the aluminum extrusions. Stopping here, I'll have some questions, but was the purpose of sending this email to Sprung to provide, to WGD to provide them the information about Sprung we've just been discussing?
Yes, I believe so. And this was after what we just looked at, right?
Yes.
So yes, this was my attempt to clarify their understanding of the sprung construction system.
In the second sentence of the email, you say, the aluminum extrusions are placed in the range of 10 to 12 feet apart, and between each is outside membrane, 9-inch insulation inside membrane. There is no thermal break in the aluminum extrusions, but they are spaced quite far apart. What are you trying to express in these sentences?
That the R30 insulative properties of the structure were not significantly compromised by the aluminum extrusions that did not have a thermal break built into them. So in a traditional, in an example of a pre-inch steel building, you have the main steel structure and then wall girts or roof purlins that go between them, and they'll be spaced at every 3 or 4 feet. And then the insulation is sandwiched most often between those girts or purlins and the exterior wall sheeting, and it's compressed. And so the spacing is in relation to the idea that this system would compromise, this system would not compromise the insulating value as much as it would be compromised in a pre-inch steel building, for example.
And how does the spacing lead you to that conclusion?
Less thermal breaks. Oh, sorry, I said that backwards. Less points where the insulating value is compromised.
We see later a reference to a term called a thermal bridge. Is that what a thermal bridge is? Is an opportunity where heating can escape in layman's terms?
Yes, that was the word I was looking for. The thermal bridge compromises the insulative properties.
So is it the case then that with the sprung structures, and to your understanding, at every point where there's an aluminum extrusion, there is an opportunity for a break in the insulation and heat to escape?
That would be correct.
And that's a thermal bridge?
That's a thermal bridge.
Okay. And in this, you say there's no thermal break in the extrusions. What is a thermal break?
It would be a configuration where the metal, which is an ideal conductor, does not go continually from the inside of the building to the outside of the building. So for instance, a window frame has an inside frame and an outside frame, and those two frames are separated by something that's insulative, so that the cold doesn't travel through the complete window frame. It would travel through the exterior part of the window frame and stop at that insulating point. And similarly, from the inside, the warm would penetrate partway through that window frame, but stop at that thermal break.
So considering the aluminum extrusions on a sprung, is the idea here that the aluminum that is on the inside of the building continues to the outside of the building without anything interrupting it in between, such that the heat loss that travels through the aluminum goes directly to the outside? Is that?
That's correct. And so then that's where the spacing of the aluminum extrusions comes in, because they are spaced far apart. Therefore, there's fewer thermal bridges.
And I just want to make sure I understand this. Is this a fair summary of what you're trying to express here, that although there are no breaks when it comes to the aluminum extrusions, the potential negative energy effects of that are mitigated by the fact that the extrusions are spaced widely apart, especially as compared to a pre-engineered steel building?
That's correct. And it's in regards to looking at the overall building enclosure.
Before you go on to something else, you say in your email, remember, you are not to contact the manufacturer in conjunction with this project at this time. So they can get the information from you, but they can't get the information directly from the manufacturer. And is that right?
Correct, and was just following through on the direction that we had.
The fact that you say that, I mean, was this were you concerned that they might contact the manufacturer? I mean, was this such a terrible thing?
I don't recall that I was particularly concerned about them contacting the manufacturer, but the direction that we were carrying out was that the CAO was going to be the point of contact with Sprung.
Okay, but they're not getting this information about the insulation from the CAO. They're getting it from you. So you're conveying the information, but they can't get it directly. That seemed odd to you at the time?
It was certainly made the process more difficult.
Right. That's fine. You were going to say, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I mean, it made the situation more difficult. And perhaps it seemed unnecessarily so, but that's what it was.
Go ahead.
Related to that, was there anything that prompted you to send this reminder at this point in time?
Nothing specific that I remember.
So if we could open the brochure that you attached to the email, which is TOC 200937. I'll take you to a couple portions of this brochure. At the outset, though, I take it this is a brochure that was provided to you by Sprung?
It came from Sprung. It may have been available on their website, or it may have been provided on their FTP site, but yes, it came from Sprung.
We could go to page 10. So this page discusses Sprung and the green footprint, and if we scroll down, the fourth bullet point down says LEED certifiable, recycled content, energy performance, durability, construction waste management, and deconstructibility. This reference to Sprung being LEED certifiable, is this an example of the sorts of things that you remember being provided or told by Sprung that led you to the belief that the Sprung structure could achieve a silver certification upon operation?
This type of information, along with their verbal explanations.
Go to the next page. This page describes a thing that is called the Sprung Shield, which is described as a virtually non-penetrable defense wall for protection against vandalism. It has multiple protective layers and rises 8 feet 6 inches around the structure. Do you recall being told anything more about the Sprung Shield at any point in time?
It was discussed, again, presented by Sprung in the verbal discussions, that this was a component available for their facilities.
During those discussions, was it just explained that this component came at an additional cost?
I would have understood that it would be, I believe I understood that it was optional. I would have understood that there would be a cost associated with it, but at that time, I had no understanding of whether it was included or excluded from what they were proposing.
When the town received the proposal and the pricing from Sprung and BLT later in August, did you believe that the Sprung Shield was included in that pricing?
I recall, I can't remember whether I thought it was included or excluded from the information that we got in August. I recall at some point, probably after that, asking whether it was included or excluded. And the answer was that it was not included.
Was that something that surprised you?
I would have thought that we would have included it.
And why would you have thought that?
Because of the enhanced security that it would provide for the facilities.
Do you remember when the meeting you're describing, in which the town was advised it wasn't included, do you remember when that happened?
I actually think when I learned that, it was after the contract was awarded.
And I appreciate it was 7 years ago. Do you have a sense of how long after the contract was awarded?
A matter of a week or two.
You remember who was at that meeting?
I think there was representatives from Sprung there. There was representatives from BLT there. There was some town staff. That's what I recall.
So was the injunction that the CAO, Mr. Houghton, was to be the only point of contact no longer in effect?
Yes, because this was after the staff report, after the contract was signed.
Okay.
It was sort of, as I recall, the kickoff meeting to start off the project.
So if we could go to paragraph 43 of summary document 2.4. So this paragraph is describing that Tom Ingersoll on August 17th provided WGD with a preliminary budget for the proposed Collingwood Arena on August 17th at 3:19 p.m. He then explains the work that is done to arrive at the budget numbers, and his conclusion at the end of the email is that based on his review, he felt the overall savings to use a fabric structure would be in the $450,000 to $550,000 range. If we go to the paragraph 45, we see that on the same day but later in the afternoon, the revised Ms. Proctor is sending a revised package with information compiled into one report from WGD, and this email encloses the final report as well as enclosed the budget numbers that Mr. Ingersoll had prepared, and we see that the roughly $500,000 difference that he identified in his email is what is incorporated into WGD's final report. Do you recall generally that was WGD's conclusion that a pre-engineered steel building would cost somewhere between $450,000 to $550,000 more than a fabric building?
Yes.
We could open the WGD report, which is TOC 0201266. Okay, so this is the report that WGD provided on August 17th, 2012. And if we could scroll to page 2. Stopping there, we see that WGD has, at the beginning of the report, listed a series of design components for the arenas it's contemplating. Other than the terms of reference that was sent in July. Was there any other, do you recall any other additional design components being sent to WGD?
Not that I recall.
We scroll down, section 2 of the report is called Green Initiatives in the New Arena. And if you look, the last sentence of the paragraph under introduction says the new arena is proposed to be designed to LEED Silver certification levels. Do you know who made that proposal?
I would believe that that was an indication that we provided to WGD because we were looking to have the two types of structures comparable in nature from an energy point of view.
Was it the case then that the town instructed WGD to include green initiatives within the pre-engineered steel building such that it would achieve a LEED Silver level?
Yes.
As part of instructing WGD with respect to LEED, do you recall if you had any discussions with WGD about whether or not the sprung structures could achieve LEED Silver levels?
I don't believe so.
If we continue scrolling down, we see that there are several initiatives that are identified by WGD, and even stopping where we are right here, we see some of the initiatives come with certain cost prices, and then some of them, it appears the cost is included in the base building cost. Was it the case that you understood that all of the green initiatives identified by WGD would need to be incorporated in a pre-engineered steel building in order for that building to achieve Silver certification?
That would come down to final design and construction design when you actually went through the points calculation. But yes, my understanding was that this was WGD's list of improvements that could be made that would get the building to the LEED Silver level.
And was it the case that you understood all of these improvements needed to be made in order to do that?
I think that was the understanding that I took at the time.
And why did you take that understanding?
Because we had asked them to tell us what it would take to get the building to a LEED Silver level.
After you received this report from WGD setting out these green initiatives, did you have, or to your knowledge, anyone on staff have further conversations with WGD about what would be required to reach this LEED Silver levels?
I don't recall any further conversations.
You keep scrolling down in the report through these. Right, continue. Going towards the end. Stopping at energy use and thermal performance. So this section is discussing R values again. WGD writes that the normal insulation value of a pre-engineered structure with a sandwich panel is R19 for roofs and R12 for walls. However, a greater R values can be achieved with insulated panels and roofs. By increasing the thickness and providing more insulation, values as high as R30 are achievable. It goes on to say membrane structures by their nature have no inherent thermal resistant R value. However, by creating a cavity, higher R values can be attained with a 6-foot cavity, and thermoplastic or similar insulation, R30 is achievable. When we looked at the first version of the WGD report, it stated that membrane structures had no inherent thermal resistance. You provided WGD with some information about sprung. Was it your view that this revised report correctly addressed the nature of insulation when it came to sprung-style fabric buildings?
Yes, I think that they had recognized the difference in the types of membrane structures, and that's where this idea of creating a cavity and filling it with insulation came from.
So in your view, the issue in the first WGD draft report had been corrected?
Yes.
It mentions here that for pre-engineered steel buildings, greater R values are available by increasing the thickness and providing more insulation. Do you know if the town or WGD ever looked into what the additional cost would be to increase a pre-engineered steel building from R19 and R12 to R30?
Not unless it was included in what WG had provided.
Do you recall if at any point you looked to see in WGD's estimates for a pre-engineered steel building if they included additional costs for additional insulation?
I don't recall looking. If it wasn't in that list above in this document, then I don't believe there was any further inquiry.
If we could scroll down. To the section up that says enclosure durability. So this is discussing the durability of a pre-engineered building as compared to a membrane structure. Stopping here for a moment, in this report, when WGD is discussing the features of membrane structures, do you know where they drew their information from?
I don't know.
Do you know if they looked beyond the information that you had provided with respect to sprung?
I don't know. I would hope that they would have done whatever research they could, but I don't know.
Looking at the last sentence of the first paragraph, it says that the pre-engineered structure, typically the roofing is TPO or PVC and is warded for 20 years. And then looking at the membrane structure, which is in the next paragraph, it says that the life expectancy before replacement of the membrane would be in the range of 20 years in the same case as PVC roofing. Was that a conclusion that you took issue with?
No, I don't recall having any issue with that.
Do you know if the town ever considered what the difference in cost would be between replacing a PVC roof or another type of roof versus replacing a sprung membrane?
It was a discussion that we had with Sprung, and I think in the early meetings. What's the life expectancy of the membrane, and so on, and their selling point on their building system was that the membrane could be replaced essentially without, from the exterior, essentially without interrupting activities inside the facility. So the membrane could be slid out, a new membrane slid in.
They say anything about what the cost of that would be?
I don't recall anything specific to the cost of that.
So if we can go down towards the end of the report, stop at the project cost. We see here the numbers that we already looked at in terms of comparing the cost of a pre-engineered building to a fabric structure. Do you know how WGD generated the estimation for a fabric structure?
I don't know where they got that information.
To your knowledge, did anyone at the town ever provide WGD with information about sprung pricing?
No.
So, looking at the WGD report that was received on August 17th, 2012, was there anything in the report that you thought WGD got wrong or was inaccurate?
With looking back at the components of the report, I can't be sure, but I don't recall anything at the moment.
We could go to paragraph 330 of the foundation document. So this is describing that on August 17th, Ms. Proctor forwarded the WGD report to Mr. Houghton, Ms. Leonard, and Ms. Almas. Mr. Houghton then replied 3 minutes later, in which he says, "Is this for Central Park? I was under the impression we told Dave they were to work on Eddie Bush only." At this point, this is the third instance where Mr. Houghton has expressed a level of uncertainty about what WGD was doing in the scope of their work. Do you have any sense of why Mr. Houghton might have been uncertain about that?
I don't know why he would have been uncertain.
Was that an impression that you had at this point in time, that it wasn't clear to Mr. Houghton what WGD was doing?
No, I think I felt that he had been informed as to what WG was doing, and maybe didn't understand, but from my perspective, I thought he had been informed.
So he says, Mr. Houghton was under the impression, Mr. Houghton writes, "I was under the impression that we told Dave they were to work on Eddie Bush only. At any point, did Mr. Houghton or another member of the EMC tell you that WGD was only to look at the Eddie Bush arena?"
I don't believe so.
Do you recall at any point in time prior to August 17th, 2012, when WGD delivered its final report, if Mr. Houghton ever gave you any directions or suggestions on what WGD should be doing in terms of its work?
I don't recall receiving any direction. I believe that we were carrying out what the intent of the council recommendations were at the time. And that he had been informed as to what we were proceeding with.
Ms. Proctor, in her testimony at the inquiry, indicated that it was her impression that Mr. Houghton had been directing you on what should or should not be included in the WGD report. Do you have any notion of why she had that sense?
No.
Similarly, Ms. Proctor also indicated that she was hoping WGD would do a broader, more traditional feasibility study, but this was impeded by instructions you received from Mr. Houghton. Is that something you recall occurring?
No.
Do you have any sense of why Ms. Proctor may have thought that was the case?
No, I don't.
So if we continue on here and we go to paragraph 331, actually just go up a bit back to 330, we see that in response to Mr. Houghton's question about whether or not you were told to work on Eddie Bush only, Ms. Proctor said that she wasn't aware of that from her discussions with you, and that she didn't think you were aware of that either. Mr. Houghton then forwards this email chain to you the next day, writing, "I think you and I need to have a discussion and get moving in the same direction." When you received this email from Mr. Houghton, do you recall what you understood he meant by it?
I think it was to align the work that WGD was doing along with perhaps the information that he was gathering so that it could start to be put together into a report.
Up until this point in time, were you and Mr. Houghton not aligned when it came to WGD and what he was doing?
If we weren't aligned prior to this point, I was not aware of it.
So, if we could go down to your reply. You respond to Mr. Houghton that you agree that the matter should be discussed. And you say, "I'm not sure how you want to present this, and there's already a draft report for Marjorie. No one said that we still didn't want the cost of brick, mortar, and steel, ellipsis." And then you went on to say, "I worked on the financial comparison template this morning and will expect to finish it tomorrow morning with plugged numbers for the sprung option. I think I do understand how the numbers might turn out, but have structured so that we can manipulate it as required, or is a comparison not advisable? Give me a call tomorrow sometime if you like, otherwise suggest a time and place. I have some commitments tomorrow afternoon." So I have a few questions about what you wrote in this email. Starting with, what is the financial comparison template that you describe?
For some time at this point, I believe I'd been creating an Excel spreadsheet that compared the cost estimates from the whole range of options that were known at the time. So going back to the proposal that came out of the steering committee, to the work that, or the estimates that WGD were to provide, the estimate that would eventually come from Sprung. And I think it also included the estimates to upgrade the Eddie Bush Arena. And so it tried to combine all of the cost estimate information we have in one comparable table.
And was part of that table intended to show the comparison of the costs of a pre-engineered steel building to a sprung structure?
Yes.
Why did you begin to prepare the spreadsheet you just described?
I think it started out to aid in my own understanding of how things compared. And I think as time went on, I kind of carried on with it because it was, I think, valuable for all of staff to be able to look at that information and do the comparison.
In your email, you write that you will expect to finish it tomorrow with plugged numbers for the sprung option. What did you mean by plugged numbers?
Because we didn't have the cost estimate from Sprung at that point in time, I made up numbers just to be able to create the spreadsheet.
Is there a reason, and I think we'll be turning up the spreadsheet shortly and it may assist, but is there a reason you wouldn't use the number that WGD had provided with respect to a sprung style fabric membrane?
There was an inherent difference, I believe. I thought there was a difference between the fabric membrane estimate that WG provided as to what we would get in the design build scenario from Sprung. The WGD estimate was still using a traditional construction method, meaning design, engineer, contract, and build. So it had those soft components and engineering and design components that would be all lumped into the design build concept from Sprung.
So if we could turn up TOC 02012666, this is the WGD report. We could go towards the bottom where we see the cost estimates. So when we see the fabric structure option B there, what in those costs is different than what would be in the costs you were expecting to receive from Sprung?
The difference in construction process. So the difference that I would see there, assuming that they had the understanding at this point that of what a sprung structure was like, and that their cost represented a structure like that, then the resulting difference, or the remaining difference, would be that WGD would still be looking at it as a traditional construction contract, design, engineer, contract, and build, versus the design-build process.
So are there costs in addition to the 7.1 million and the 1.16 million that are identified here?
My assumption that they would be included in those numbers.
And when Sprung sends you numbers, would those not be included in those numbers as well?
They would be included, but would generally inherently be less expensive than doing it in the traditional contract method.
So at this point in time, because you don't have the Sprung or BLT numbers yet, is it your expectation then that Sprung and BLT will be providing an estimate for the arena that is going to be less than what WGD has identified because it will have less engineering and design costs built into it?
I didn't know what the numbers were going to be, but I would have thought that concept would be true.
If we could go to paragraph 332 again. Sorry, scroll up to 331. So this was the email we were looking at that you were sending to Mr. Houghton. You then say, I think I do understand how the numbers might turn out. At that point in time, what did you mean by that?
I'm not sure, other than expressing an opinion of where my thoughts were at that time.
Do you remember what your thoughts were at that time?
No.
And then you write, but have structured so that we can manipulate as required. What do you mean by that?
I think that is to ensure that that the different facilities could be compared on the same basis, so an apples to apples comparison in terms of the features that they would include and so forth.
At this point in time, did you have a sense of what parts of the numbers may need manipulation?
No, I think I had considered the upgrades to get the WGD proposed facility, or at least the pre-eng facility, up to the LEED Silver standard. I think I was wanting to be able to make sure that all of the components were equal. Same number of dressing rooms, same features.
The email contemplates that, or you tell Mr. Houghton that he can give you a call or otherwise suggest a time and place. Do you recall if you had a conversation with Mr. Houghton after sending this email about the comparison analysis that you had begun to undertake and were going to continue?
What date was this?
August 18th, 2012.
I don't have a specific recollection of a discussion.
Do you know why at this point you asked Mr. Houghton whether or not a comparison a comparison of the numbers would be advisable?
I think because there was confusion about where the report was going to go. There was a draft of the report that was being circulated, but it had no it wasn't to the point where there was outcomes coming from the report. And I was probably looking to the CIO for some direction on where he wanted to go with it.
Do you recall if you got any direction from him about whether or not a comparison should be included?
I don't recall specifically.
In your mind, was there any reason why a comparison would not be advisable?
Not in my mind, because that was a large point of the exercise that we went through, and that in a draft form, I think, I'm not sure at this point, but in a draft form, that information was already pasted into the report into the draft report.
And we do see that, and we'll see it later, that the spreadsheet that you create does form part of earlier drafts of the report. Was that something you thought should be included in the report?
Yes.
And why did you think it should be included in the report?
Because that was consistent with what council had asked staff to do.
Can you just explain that a bit further?
In the options that they selected at the prior council meeting, the one of them at least was fairly specific, I think, to providing cost estimates for different types of arenas for Central Park.
So I take it from your answer then, but please correct me if I'm wrong. Something you thought should be included in the report was comparing the prices of those two options, or of more than one option.
Yes.
We're going to walk through the price comparison exercise that you undertook. Before starting that, at any point in time, did you recall receiving any direction from Mr. Houghton about how to approach the price comparison?
I don't believe so.
Received direction from anyone else that you can recall?
No.
I think before you do that, we'll take a short break, give everybody a few minutes.
Yep.
Please be seated.
We could go to paragraph 333 of the foundation document. Bring you here just to assist you in time, Mr. McNulty. This is an email dated August 18th, 2012 from Marjorie Leonard, where she sends a draft staff report with respect to the pool and arena that are being looked into. Again, just put that there, so that point in time. So if we can go ahead to paragraph 342. This reflects that on August 19th at 8:05 p.m., you send Ed Houghton comments on the staff report that Ms. Leonard had circulated, the one that we just saw, and you also provide a chart comparing the costs of a twin ice pad and community center, a pre-engineered steel building, and an insulated fabric membrane structure. I'm going to pull up the first of those attachments, the second attachment, which is the comparison TOC 020155. And if it's possible to zoom out to get a better sense of the whole spreadsheet. So you were describing earlier a spreadsheet that you prepared looking at the cost of the Central Park, cost of pre-engineered steel building, a fabric memory building, as well as the costs associated with the Eddie Bush. Is this a version of the spreadsheet that you were describing?
Yes.
Going to the third column or box, which talks about the insulated fabric membrane structure. There are the numbers in there. Where were they from? How were they generated?
At this point in time, this may have been partly what I had said earlier or in an email about it being plug numbers, essentially numbers that I made up. I think there was a way early estimate from Sprung that had a number based on a generic design, and I may have drew from that.
At this point in time, was this essentially placeholder numbers?
Yes.
So I'll have some questions about the calculations with respect to the pre-engineered steel building. Looking at this, it appears that these were these numbers were built based on the information that was provided to you by WGD in its report and its budget breakdown. Is that correct?
Yes.
Sorry, which ones are you referring to?
The pre-engineered steel
Okay.
building, yeah. So starting at the very top, the first line item is the single pad with potential to be twinned in the future, and the amount there is $6,856,157.26. If you recall, in the WGD report, the price of the pre-engineered building was $7,632,124. Do you know how you arrived at this $6.8 million number?
Having looked at these numbers recently, the difference in the numbers was pulling out the soft costs associated with what was in the WGD information, in the detailed information. So there was a design contingency and another contingency that I backed out so I would get to more bare hard costs as a starting point.
So if we could pull up on the screen TOC 0201-219. And for the benefit of council, this is, I've passed around a hard copy of this document, so as a point of reference, and we can provide one to Mr. McNulty too, as we compare. Are these the WGD detailed cost numbers that you were referring to?
Yes.
So we see on the first page, there's a 5% design contingency. Is that what you were referring to when you said you took out a design contingency?
Yes.
Okay. And if we could go to the last page and scroll down to the bottom, there's a line item there for a 5% construction contingency. Do you see that?
Yes.
That the construction contingency you removed?
Yes.
Okay. And so if we can turn back up TOC 0201-565. So when we have done the calculation, that $6,856,000 figure there, if you subtract the $7,632,124 that WGD identified in its report, if you subtract the two contingencies we just looked at, you arrive at that number. Does that sound correct?
Yes.
And can you provide more detail about how you identified these first as soft costs and then why you removed them as a starting point for your calculation?
Because in any of the comparison I was making here, I wanted to be able to add up the hard costs and then apply a contingency appropriately to those costs depending on what type of a construction process I envisioned it to be. And so I didn't want to be double counting the contingencies.
Was there a reason that you didn't want to use the contingencies that WGD had put in its own calculations?
It may have been as simple as it wouldn't fit in my spreadsheet properly.
Other than that, can you think of any other reason?
No.
So we have the base $6.8 million number. You then add, or it appears that there's several recommended upgrades added. What are those recommended upgrades?
Those were the, I believe that those were the upgrades that WGD presented as options to be able to bring the building to LEED Silver level.
And it appears from our review that every one of the options that WGD provided was included. Why did you include every option they had identified?
Because the way that I understood it, those would be the options that would get the building enough points to get to the LEED Silver level.
We see that in certain instances, WGD provided a range when it was costing out these initiatives, and in each case, the high end of the range was selected for the spreadsheet. Do you know why that was the case?
I don't know.
Beneath the options that were identified by WGD, it has upgrade insulation and then 2 question marks. What is that referring to?
It refers to the discussion of taking the pre-inch steel building from the R12 walls and R19 roof insulation to the R30 level.
And I understand from your earlier answers that was a calculation that, to your knowledge, was not determined.
Correct.
Do you have any sense of what that would have costed?
I would have to say no. I would have to look it up.
So, those green initiatives total $1.15 million. The next line item is 1.164281 million, and if you recall in the WGD report, that was a line item or a number they had calculated for site costs that are common to site costs common to building types. Does that sound correct to you?
Yes.
And so if we could pull up TOC 0201266. And go to the bottom, page 10, I believe. So that's that figure there.
Yes.
And what are these, what sort of work can you, it is itemized there, but can you give us a sense of what sort of work is incorporated in that 1.16 million?
Essentially everything outside of the building envelope. So site preparation, electrical services to the site, mechanical services to the site, parking lots, fences, anything external to the building envelope.
And when WG wrote site costs common to building types, was it your understanding that WGD's view is that this $1.16 million figure would apply whether a fabric structure or a pre-engineered steel structure was erected?
Yes.
Do you take any issue with that conclusion?
The these cost estimates would from WGD would also envision that they be part of a traditional design engineer contract build scenario. And so so it would be subject to those consulting costs and so forth outside of the actual cost of construction.
So, other than that, this amount may contain consulting and engineering costs, is there anything about a fabric structure and a pre-engineered building that would make the site costs more or less?
No.
So to the extent there was a design build, pre-engineered still building, you would expect that to have the same costs as a design build fabric structure building?
Yes.
If we could go back to the chart we were looking at, which was TOC 201565. So we've looked at the next figure. So we've looked at the figure for site and park development. The next line item is design fees, permits, miscellaneous 5%. What is that percentage representing?
So it represents the architect, the engineer, and the costs associated with those, the costs associated with the likes of building permits, and it kind of replaces the design. The design contingency is different. So it adds back that design component to the overall project.
When you say it add back the design component, are you talking about the 5% that WGD had in its cost breakdown?
Looking at this budget and the notes that are on it, design contingency in this place, in this case, I would believe would be a contingency put in place for changes that might be made to the design during the course of the development of the detailed design.
So, is your understanding WGD, in calculating its estimates, included a 5% contingency for potential design changes? Does that concept find its way into the calculation you've done on this spreadsheet?
No, I don't believe so.
Is there a reason why you didn't include it?
Because it would tend to artificially inflate the number. And my objective was to make it an objective comparison.
How would it artificially inflate the number?
It would make the assumption that there was going to be design changes through that design process.
Okay, and that's something an assumption WGD appeared to have made.
Yes.
And I just want to make sure I understand, in your view, why it was an assumption that you didn't make at this point.
In my thought process at the time, I wanted to have the comparison as bare bones and objective as I could make it, and I didn't see a reason to add that back in.
So when we look at the design fees, permits miscellaneous, the 5%, permits, I think you said were for building permits?
Primarily.
And would there be any difference in terms of the permitting that a fabric building would need as compared to a pre-engineered steel building?
Not on an order of magnitude, because the permit fee is based on the project value.
The design fees that's identified here, are those the consulting and engineering fees that you were discussing that are not included when you do a traditional construction project?
Yes, the architect, the engineer, and so forth.
So a component of this 5% is accounting for those fees that would be incurred for a non-design build.
Correct.
And when it comes to miscellaneous, is there anything in particular you had in mind?
Not that I can recall.
Is there anything that would be miscellaneous for a pre-eng steel building that wouldn't be a cost you would anticipate for a fabric building?
Not that I can think of.
Then the next line, actually staying on that, do you know why you set this number at 5%?
Often those numbers are set based on sort of industry practice and standard, where as a matter of course, the architect and engineering costs can either be charged on the basis of a percentage or on the basis of a lump sum, but for the purposes of estimating, they're normally applied as a percentage.
And is 5% a standard percentage?
It would be a low percentage, considering the entire build. A more typical estimate there might be 8 to 10% for considering the entire design, engineer, construction supervision, contract administration components of the work.
Is there a reason you picked a lower percentage?
I don't know at this point.
The next line item is a contingency for 10%. What does that represent?
A sum of money that allows for unexpected circumstances, certain design changes, and for potential errors in the cost estimate that you're working with.
And I take it from the answer there, is it the case then that to the extent there could be design changes that would affect cost, that's included in that 10%?
Yes.
Do you know how you arrived at the figure of 10%?
It's, again, a normal contingency established for estimating purposes, and it's normal contingency when dealing with town projects.
We see when WGE calculated its numbers, it had two 5% contingencies. Is it possible that you added those contingencies into one line item and made it 10%?
That would be a fair assumption on the thought process.
Do you recall if that's what you did, or?
I don't recall specifically.
After you did this calculation with the pre-engineered steel building, did you show this calculation to anyone?
Not specifically, unless I circulated the document.
Going back to the contingency, well, the numbers for the fabric membrane are placeholder or potentially from an earlier estimate. You have a contingency there of 5%. Had you turned your mind at this point in time to what an appropriate contingency would be for the fabric building?
It would be less because it would be a design build process.
And
So there's less opportunity for change during the course of the design and the construction. And so less requirement for a contingency.
so the reduced contingency reflects the nature of a design build process as opposed to reflecting something that is different between the nature of a pre-engineered building or a fabric building?
Yes.
We go to paragraph 344 of the foundation document. So if you recall, we were looking at I believe an August 19th email that you sent Mr. Houghton with two attachments. The first attachment was the spreadsheet that we had been looking at. The second attachment was revisions that you had made to the draft of the staff report that Ms. Leonard had circulated. So this paragraph is discussing some of the revisions you made. Scroll down. So this is with respect to the pool, and you write, keep scrolling down. No, sorry, stay on those paragraphs. I'm just trying to locate the... So if you look at the second paragraph in the second sentence, you're describing the nature of a design build, and you say, this allows the project to carry a minimal contingency and a relatively small allowance for permits and fees. Are you referring to the concept we just discussed about why design builds are likely to have less cost increases as the project proceeds?
Yes. And that is contingent on the fact, though, that you define the expectations of the design build project upfront, so that the design becomes almost set at that point in time. Whereas in the traditional process, the design kind of evolves as the project continues.
In the case of the arena and the pool, when council voted to proceed with both of those items, from your perspective, had the design been set such that this contingency assumption would stand? No, not at that time. You know why it hadn't been said at that point in time?
At the point in time when council, what point in time, sorry?
August 27th, 2012, when council votes to proceed with the arena and the pool.
So at that point in time, yes, the design concept in terms of the design build option would be set because we had the price that they were offering.
We see with respect to the pool, the contingency percentage is there, and it's also 5%. Does that contingency take into contemplation the potential for change orders that may arise during a design build?
Only minimal changes.
So the assumption there is there will not be many
There would
change
not
orders?
be significant changes from the agreed to concept.
We can go to paragraph 345. So again, this is discussing revisions you made to a draft report prepared by Ms. Leonard, and in it says that the pros for the pool as including construction materials for the insulated fabric membrane cover. Sorry, you revised that language, and you revised Ms. Leonard's language to read, there are several successful pool applications using this type of construction identified across North America. Do you recall why you added this language at this point in time?
Not specifically.
At this time, did you know how many swimming pools there were in North America that were either enclosed by a sprung structure or a similar product?
I can't remember what I knew at the time. The statement would have been based on some research.
Do you recall what research it was based on?
No.
You recall having a sense generally in the August 2012 period how many pools Sprung had built before this?
I know I had a sense. I can't remember numbers, but I had a sense of how many facilities of different types were, specifically of their facilities were across North America.
Specifically with pools, did you have a sense of how many pools there were?
I don't recall specifically.
So if we could go to paragraph 338. So paragraph 338 shows that on the same day that you're providing Mr. Houghton with comments on Ms. Leonard's staff report, or the first draft of it, he has provided a copy to Deputy Mayor Rick Lloyd and asking him to read it. And if we can scroll down, we see that Mr. Deputy Mayor Lloyd provides some feedback in the form of an email. And if you scroll down to paragraph 341, he provides some further feedback in which he says that he also sees some other areas that need reworded, i.e. no other pools in Ontario of this construction. I would rather indicate that there are many pools in North America with this construction. Were you aware that Mr. Houghton had sent a draft of the staff report to Deputy Mayor Lloyd?
I don't have a recollection of that. Was I? I don't know if I was copied or not.
In respect of the emails between Mr. Houghton and Deputy Mayor Lloyd, it does not appear you were.
And I don't believe that I was aware.
At any point, do you recall Deputy Mayor Lloyd communicating to you that he would rather the staff report indicate that there were many pools in North America with this construction?
No.
Did Mr. Houghton ever provide you feedback along those lines?
Not that I can recall.
Is it possible that Mr. Houghton or Mr. Lloyd did provide you that piece of feedback, and that is what the reason for the change to the staff report that you made?
I don't have any recollection of that. If I was provided that information through an email exchange or something like that, it could be. I don't remember any discussion. I have no reason to link the two.
Even though the wording is similar?
I have no recollection of it.
Stepping back from that specific suggestion that Deputy Mayor Lloyd made, in your experience, was it common for council members to review and provide suggestions on early drafts of staff reports?
No.
From your perspective, is that something that would cause you concern?
In my opinion, members of council shouldn't be directing staff on the contents of a staff report.
And why not?
Because it puts them in a position of directing staff in the first place, it can put undue pressure on staff to be able to modify a report, to create a report that would suit a specific council member.
Is that a concern you had at any point in the drafting of this staff report?
I don't think I was really aware that there was any consultation of that sort going on.
We go to paragraph 347 of the foundation document. So this is again looking at some of the changes that you made to the initial draft that Ms. Leonard had circulated. If we can scroll down, going to the text beneath that. Keep going down. Scroll up again. Okay, we'll leave that and go back to paragraph 342 of the foundation document. So we've now looked, Mr. McNulty, at the version of the spreadsheet you created comparing the cost of fabric structures to pre-engineered steel structures and other options, and the changes you made to Ms. Leonard's staff report. We've gone back now to the covering email that you sent Mr. Houghton. If we can scroll down, you write, you explain what you've done, and then when it, with respect to Ms. Leonard's draft staff report, you write, look in the body of the report and please let me know if this direction is what you intend before I go further along. Do you recall if prior to making these revisions, you had any discussions with Mr. Houghton about the direction he intended to take?
I don't have any specific recollection unless it's one of the conversations that have been suggested previously here.
Right, what do you mean by that?
I mean, there was, I'm not sure of the time frame here, I guess, but there was something about me asking what direction the report should take and whether a cost comparison is advisable and so forth. Was that before or after this point?
Are you discussing the email where Mr. Houghton says that you two should discuss to get on the same page?
Perhaps.
It ends with you suggesting a call or a meeting? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
That was before this.
And so in answer to your current question, which was, I'm sorry, I lost it.
Prior to sending this revised draft to Mr. Houghton, do you recall if you spoke to him about the direction he intended for the staff report?
I don't have a specific recollection, but I could have.
Speaking more generally, did you have a sense in this point of time what Mr. Houghton intended for the staff report?
At August 19th, I don't think I was clear.
You say at the end of the email, I have not distributed this elsewhere at this point pending your approval and suggestions. Why did you send these documents to Mr. Houghton first to seek his approval and suggestions?
I don't know specifically why.
Can you think, is there any reason that you can think of why, before circulating your preliminary calculations and your revisions of the staff report, you'd want to make sure that Mr. Houghton was in agreement with the approach you'd taken?
We may have had a conversation subsequent to the prior email. Maybe I was trying to clarify the direction, not only for myself, but also to be able to clarify the direction to the other members of staff that were working on this. So rather than introduce another level of confusion, maybe I wanted to get confirmation that that was the direction that he was wanting to go before we circulated the report for further input, or it may have been a waste of effort.
This time, do you recall there being uncertainty among yourself or other staff members about the direction this was ultimately going?
In the direction that the report was going to go, yes.
I take it then from what you're saying, it was you were looking to Mr. Houghton to make the decision about that direction?
Yes.
When you say the direction this is going, what do you mean? What options were on the table in your mind at this point?
I think the idea of a pre-inch steel building for an arena being compared to a fabric membrane structure excuse me, for an arena, and plus the option of a fabric structure over the pool. I think all of those options were on the table.
So beginning with the arena, was it the case that at this point you didn't know whether or not the direction would be to recommend to proceed with either a pre-engineered building or a fabric structure for the arena?
I didn't know what the recommendation would be at this point in time.
Was there anything being contemplated other than those two options with respect to the arena?
Not that I recall.
With the pool at this point in time, what were the potential recommendations you thought may be coming?
I think with the pool, the recommendation would be proceed with a fabric membrane enclosure for the pool or not. So it might be more of an option at that point to proceed with it or not based on the numbers and information in the report.
And who was it in your mind who would make the decisions about, of those options you've now laid out for the arena and the pool, who would make the decision on what to recommend to council?
Ultimately, it would be the CAO in this instance because of his involvement in the process. It would be the CAO with input from the EMC, the department head, and myself.
Was one of the options being considered at this point or at any point recommending to council that further investigation be undertaken with respect to either the pool or the arena?
I don't recall any discussion around that.
Would that be a recommendation that staff would be in a position to make if they had decided they wanted to?
Staff at an executive level.
And who are the staff at the executive level?
I mean, the CAO could present that to council in this circumstance. I certainly wouldn't have been in a position to present that.
Appreciating that you wouldn't have been in a position to present that, was it your view at the time that further investigation would be beneficial?
Always. Further investigation would certainly have been beneficial, but the time frame for the report was set.
We spoke about timing on Tuesday. Do you know, I appreciate it was council who set the time frame. Do you know why they set it for that period of time and not a month later, 2 months later?
I don't know. Just to put a sense of urgency on it, I suppose. I don't know.
At this point in time, while you're looking for guidance on the direction this is going to go, and other members of staff may also be looking for that guidance, had the procurement options been discussed in terms of if we were going to proceed with Sprung, whether there'll be an RFP, if we're going to proceed with a pre-engineered steel building, whether it be an RFP?
Do I remember any discussion? No, but I believe at this point the report envisioned an RFP process beyond the report.
You know why that was the case?
it was I suppose, a reflection of the typical process.
Go to paragraph 360 of the foundation document. So this is an email that you sent Mr. Houghton on August 21st, 2012. And in the email, you're sending him the estimates that Sprung had sent just over a month earlier on July 16th. Do you know why you sent Mr. Houghton the July 16th estimates at this point in time?
So I believe that back at July 16th, those estimates were the preliminary estimates based on the preliminary concept that they'd come up with. And those estimates were, along with the preliminary concept, were posted on an FTP site, and and so to answer your question, I think if I remember your question, why was I asked to send, or why was I sending it, was because I was asked by Ed if I could send it to him.
You know what Ed wanted that information for?
No.
At this point in time, do you know what sort of conversations Mr. Houghton was having with either Sprung or BLT?
No.
We see that in the next paragraph, Mr. Houghton forwarded your email to Mr. Bonwick. Was that something you were aware of?
No.
If we go to paragraph 380 of the foundation document. So this is August 22nd, 2012. And to put it in context, the council meeting in which the report is due is August 27th, 2012. At this point in time, staff has WGD's numbers, but Ms. Leonard is emailing you and asking if you had received anything from Sprung yet, and you said not yet. Then Ms. Leonard says, I guess we won't have this report ready for noon tomorrow. I take it from this email at this point in time, as far as you knew, staff didn't have the numbers or the budgets that Sprung and BLT were putting together.
Correct.
You know why they weren't ready yet? Or why they hadn't been provided yet?
No, I don't know why.
From your perspective, did it cause you concern that this information hadn't come through yet?
Yes, well, understanding that in order to have the report distributed with the council agenda for the 27th, it needed to be, or at least the protocol was to have it delivered in its final form to the clerk by the Thursday at noon before, and the report still had to be finalized, reviewed, recommendations determined, and so on.
I take it from the version of the two things. At this point in time, had the recommendations been discussed or determined?
No.
We looked at the spreadsheet you had prepared earlier, which had placeholder numbers for Sprung. Were you waiting on Sprung to provide its numbers in order to populate that part of the spreadsheet?
Yes, I believe so.
What were you anticipating you would do with Sprung's numbers once they arrived?
Complete the comparison between the options.
Were you contemplating you may need to make adjustments to the Sprung numbers?
No, I don't know what adjustments I would have made to the Sprung numbers.
You go to paragraph 384.
Just before you do that, if Mr. Houghton was the point of contact, why is Ms. Leonard asking you if you have the numbers?
I would only assume that she might wonder if Mr. Houghton had provided them to me and she hadn't seen them yet.
Wouldn't ask him?
She could have, should have asked him, but
What was she thinking, or did you, is there any reason why she would think that you would be in contact with Sprung when apparently this edict had been issued that nobody was to speak to Sprung except Mr. Houghton?
no, there's no reason to suggest that.
So, looking at paragraph 384, at 2:56 p.m. on August 22nd, Dave Barrow of BLT sent Mr. Houghton numbers for the budget numbers for the pool and arena, and you can see the number totals there. We see that Mr. Houghton forwarded them on to Ms. Leonard, who then forwarded them on to you. We spoke a couple times now about the nature of the investigative process and when it ended. We've seen that the staff report has begun to be the drafts of the staff report have circulated at this point in time. Did you have any concern that after that process had began, Mr. Houghton appeared to be in contact with BLT and was receiving budget numbers from them?
I don't remember having specific concerns at the time. But it would have been better if all this information was received much sooner, as opposed to it coming at the last minute.
And why would that have been better from a procurement perspective?
Because when it overlaps like that, it crosses the line between the investigative process and sort of the blackout period where you've finished the investigation and then you're moving on with further evaluation.
Maybe be of assistance. Can you walk us through what the steps of a normal procurement process referencing some of the points you just mentioned?
With many projects, we're not the experts. We don't have all the information when a project concept comes along. And so in order to educate ourselves and be able to develop the scope of the project that we intend to carry out, in some cases we might look to a consultant to assist with that. In some cases we might do our own research to determine what's available in the market and so forth. And that I would call the investigation period, where you do that initial research and preparation for a project. At the point where you start to develop an RFP or a competition document, that process should be completed and shouldn't be revisited. And we kind of term it a blackout period where based on the information that we receive from our investigation, now we're putting together the specifications, the criteria for the RFP or the competition. And from then through to the time that the document is released, potential bidders, is a blackout period. Beyond that, then there's an open communication period, transparent open communication period between the vendors and the owner, or the town in this case, where they have the opportunity to ask questions. Everybody gets to see the questions. Everybody gets to see the answers to the questions up until essentially the closing of the competition. And then depending on the format of the competition, it could be an open, it could be a straightforward tender with a public opening where the results are essentially known at the time of the project closing, or it could be, in the case of an RFP, there could be an evaluation period where you take the proposals, evaluate them, generally by staff or other peers that you've invited to evaluate. And that, again, that evaluation period is another blackout period where there's no communication regarding that evaluation or the proposals up to the point of award of the project, and then it becomes public information.
Looking at the process you just laid out there, what's the purpose of the first blackout period between the investigation and the release of the procurement?
It's to avoid the problem or the perception that there's favoritism built into the process of developing the document.
And what do you mean by favoritism?
That might give one bidder an advantage over another bidder.
Looking at the process that was unfolding here, do you see there is a potential for a perception of an unfair process with Sprung and BLT being in contact with staff at this point?
On the basis that the intention was to go ahead with an RFP or a competition process, then yes, that overlap could have presented the perception of a problem.
Had a decision been made at this point on August 22nd when the Sprung and BLT send their numbers that there would be a sole source procurement?
Not that I understood.
If there's communications in the blackout period, what kind of consequences can that have for a procurement?
I mean, I guess there's lots of different potential consequences. One of them is certainly the perception of a particular bidder having an advantage over other bidders. Certainly it could lead to legal challenges in the future, and I mean that's why the blackout period is there to mitigate those risks.
Would a supplier that communicates in that blackout period face disqualification in a future procurement?
That could be the case.
So you receive, Mr. Hout,
Are you moving on to,
I'm staying within this paragraph, but moving on to a different part of the paragraph. So
I'm just wondering if it makes sense to break for
it
an
does,
hour.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So we'll take the lunch break now. We'll come back at 10 to 2.
Order all rise.
And that's
Those are on tap.
that's going to be my favorite, so that's what I'm going to have. And,
Okay,
and
I'm
Bob,
gonna try the white, the bellows, or what do you call
Black
it?
Bellows. That's
Black
right.
bellows, you know? Never heard of it. Oh well.
Let's get that one pouring.
Fish and Sips. What an interesting name, I must admit. You know, when I first heard about this place, I thought, oh, just some new guy in town opening up a place. I didn't realize that you're decades in the
for you.
business. Decades. Look
That's
at that.
right.
Does that look inviting? I'll tell you.
It's really refreshing. That beer, I love it almost as much as this beer.
Yeah. Look at the difference in color there for the viewers at home. Those are two completely different beers. This is the Collingwood, and this is the Black Bellows.
Black Bellows.
Black
yeah.
Bellows.
It's a Belgian wit. This